Canadians have traditionally defined themselves by our relationship with our closest neighbor, the United States. Over the years, our two countries have become more interconnected, raising fears that we Canadians are becoming Americanized and our sense of selves as Canadians is becoming lost. This video will explore fears and suspicions of Americanization, asking the question, has it gone too far? The United States is an economic and military powerhouse. Its influence is prolific throughout the world, making concerns about Americanization global. But for Canadians, Americanization has been a pressing concern for generations, largely because we are an evolving nation and, as such, we have difficulty defining what it means to be Canadian because what a Canadian is always changing, perhaps with the exception of being a Canadian means not being an American. It cannot be denied that American culture and influence is prolific. While Big Macs and Katy Perry songs can be enjoyed in almost every corner of the earth, the question should be asked, at what cost? And no truer is that for anywhere than it is for Canada. So, in what ways have Canadians become Americanized? Well, more and more our political culture has become akin to our American neighbors. Political campaigns have adopted mudslinging, character jabs, and attack ads often associated with U.S. elections. Campaigns focus on federal leaders more so than local candidates, even though Canadians don't directly vote for the Prime Minister. In our general election in 2011, then federal Liberal leader Michael Ignatieff accused Prime Minister Harper of exercising too much executive power, in essence acting more like a president who has veto power than a prime minister who requires parliamentary approval and royal assent and cannot veto under any circumstances. Prime Minister Harper has worked in cooperation with the United States on a number of matters, stressing the importance of strong relations between our two countries. This hasn't always been the case. In the late 1960s until the early 1980s, Canada did not always have amicable relations with the U.S. In fact, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and President Richard Nixon were quite forthright in their dislike for one another. It was also at this time Canada pointedly sought relations with countries such as China and Cuba that were not being formally recognized by the United States. However, a number of Stephen Harper's initiatives to standardize regulations and services across the border and introduce policy more consistent with the U.S. has been subject to much criticism, heightening concerns that Canada will undergo a shift in values and adopt policies that may not be wanted here. Nevertheless, Canada has become increasingly reliant upon U.S. protection and, as a consequence, is often expected to support the U.S. in military conflict. In 2003, Prime Minister Jacques Chrétien famously refused to send Canadian troops to the war in Iraq with the Americans, who desperately searched for weapons of mass destruction. In the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson opposed America's war in Vietnam and made veiled yet disparaging comments about the U.S. while visiting there, much to the dismay of President Lyndon B. Johnson, who rather aggressively scolded Pearson for his comments. While Canada has not always agreed with every military engagement taken on by the United States, our economic relations have strengthened and our economies have become more intertwined. According to Paul Nesbitt Larking, the Americanization of Canada's political culture is undermining our sovereignty. noting that many of our political institutions, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, have been shaped to reflect their American counterparts. And as we fail to distinguish ourselves from the America's way, we may become the first post nation, an address with no fixed identity. Over the years, many efforts have been made to preserve Canadian culture, from the creation of the CBC, national television broadcaster intent on promoting Canadian culture, ideas, and issues, to the National Film Board to ensure the survival of Canadian cinema against the allure of Hollywood, to the formation of the Canadian Radio Television Communication Commission to establish broadcast standards and to mandate a percentage of Canadian content is aired by all Canadian broadcasters. Despite these efforts to promote our own talent, many Canadians still prefer American entertainment, with Canadian entertainment only comprising 24% of the markets in Canada. So is Canadian culture in jeopardy? Take a minute to think of as many Canadian musicians, films, TV shows, books, and sports versus American. When you are done, look at the list. Which one is longer? Which one was easier to write? What does this exercise do to your opinion of Americanization? While we have access to Canadian programs, the vast majority are American. Young Canadians are raised in American culture, recognizing American symbols and icons ahead of their own. Americanization, however, has also given rise to anti-American attitudes. Nevertheless, their corporations dominate our everyday lives, even when, in the case of Target, they specifically carried Canadian brands and merchandise, making it more and more difficult for Canadian companies to compete and survive.
It's funny you should mention that, because I was going to ask you this first question. When you were a boy in Canada, you were a boy.
Ish.
Okay. Things, I think, were different. The United States and Canada were more alike. When you were, skiing on the snow-capped plains of Manitoba.
Yes, I'm with you so far.
With the Maple Mounties. I don't know what But it seems like in that era, the United States and Canada were more alike, and in the last 30 or 40 years, we've kind of grown apart. Canada is a country that has health care and not a lot of gun violence, and, and we've become just a more warlike, mean, cramped, conservative country. You think that's true?
Well, I think it depends on which era you're talking about. 30 years ago, I think it was Reagan and Pierre Trudeau, but then Brian Mulroney came in for a long time. He was conservative. Right now, we have a conservative prime minister.
But conservative in Canada is not the same as
That's true. But listen, it's an interesting. It's interesting on the cab ride here tonight, because they wouldn't send a car. I was
that's not true. That is not true.
No, it's it's a recession.
All right. You're half right.
I was thinking that, these two countries have an unbelievable closeness.
Yeah.
We're the aliens you don't deport.
Right.
And
right.
And it's always been that way. We are a different country. We're a parliamentary country. We're 36 million people, and yet we're the second largest country in the world, or big-boned, as we like to call it. And but we, gays in the military passed in '92 with no fanfare.
Right. That's what I mean. That's how we've grown apart, is that the progressive things that we should have been doing in that time, Canada has done, and we have lagged behind.
Yeah, I think that we became...
because of Mike.
Totally. Absolutely. 24/7, I'm on it, yeah.
But I actually think that Canada was a little more conservative, and then it became a little more European. And certainly,
yes.
It's a more social democratic country.
Right.
But, you have cooler...
In recent years, even though our economies have grown closer together and have been subject of U.S. economic dominance, Canadian values and beliefs tend to remain quite different than those of our American neighbors. Our need for individual distinctiveness and fear of Americanization have transmitted into a vigilant stance to protect and preserve elements of Canadiana, no matter how minute. Take the Timbit, for example. In December 2014, a rumor started by a satirical newspaper circulated that Burger King, Tim Hortons' new owner, was going to drop the Timbit from its menu. Canadians took to social media declaring their love for the Timbit and all things Canadian and decrying Burger King and Americans for attacking an important emblem of our culture and national identity. Lucky for us, the article was a farce and the Timbit is going nowhere. But it shows how deeply we feel this threat of Americanization. After considering the information shared in this video, ask yourself, has Canada's culture become Americanized? What predictions do you have for the future? Do you share the same view as the majority of Canadians?